Hello again, and welcome to Let's Read with Mr. Thomas. Today we're reading from Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. We're reading Chapter 3. Why would I not have made up my mind? I want to say a few words about that in particular. After all, people who know how to revenge themselves and to take care of themselves in general, how do they do it? After all, when they are possessed, let us suppose, by the feeling of revenge, then for the time there is nothing else but that feeling left in their whole being. Such a man simply rushes straight toward his object like an infuriated bull with its horns down, and nothing but a wall will stop him. By the way, facing the wall, such people, that is, the straightforward person and men of action, are genuinely nonplussed. For them, a wall is not an invasion or evasion, as for example for us, people who think and consequently do nothing. It is not an excuse for turning aside, an excuse for which our kind is always very glad, though we scarcely believe it in ourselves. Usually, no, they are nonplussed in all sincerity. The wall has for them something tranquilizing, morally soothing, finally, maybe even something mysterious. But of the wall later. Well, such a direct person I regard as the real, normal man, as his tender mother nature wished to see him when she graciously brought him into being on the earth. I envy such a man till I am green in the face. He is stupid. I'm not disputing that, but perhaps the normal man should be stupid. How do you know? Perhaps it is very beautiful, in fact. And I am all the more convinced of that suspicion, if one can call it so, by the fact that if, for instance, you take the antithesis of the normal man, that is, the hyperconscious man, who has come, of course, not out of the lap of nature, but out of a retort. This is almost mysticism, gentlemen, but I suspect this too. This retort-made man is sometimes so nonplussed in the presence of his antithesis that with all his hyperconsciousness, he genuinely thinks of himself as a mouse and not a man. It may be a hyperconsciousness mouse, yet it is a mouse, while the other is a man, and therefore, etc. And the worst is, he himself, his very own self, looks upon himself as a mouse. No one asks him to do so, and that is the important point. Now let us look at this mouse in action. Let us suppose, for instance, that it feels insulted, too, and it almost always does feel insulted, and wants to revenge itself, too. There may even be a greater accumulation of spite in it than in l'homme de la nature et de la vérité. The base, nasty desire to repay with spite whoever has offended it rankles perhaps even more nastily in it than in l'homme de la nature et de la vérité, because l'homme de la nature et de la vérité, through his innate stupidity, looks upon his revenge as justice pure and simple, while in consequence of his hyperconsciousness, the mouse does not believe in the justice of it. To come at last to the deed itself, to the very act of revenge. Apart from the one fundamental nastiness the unfortunate mouse succeeds in creating around it so many other nastinesses in the form of doubts and questions, adds to the one question so many unsettled questions that there inevitably works up around it a sort of fatal brew, a stinking mess, made up of its doubts, agitations, and lastly of the contempt spat upon it by the straightforward men of action who stand solemnly about it as judges and arbiters, laughing at it till their healthy sides ache. Of course, the only thing left for it is to dismiss all that with a wave of its paw, and with a smile of assumed contempt in which it does not even believe itself, creep ignominiously into its mouse hole. There, in its nasty, stinking, underground home, our insulted, crushed, and ridiculed mouse promptly becomes absorbed in a cold, malignant, and, above all, everlasting spite. For 40 years together it will remember its injury down to the smallest, most shameful detail, and every time will add of itself details still more shameful, spitefully teasing and irritating itself with its own imagination. It will be ashamed of its own fancies, but yet it will recall everything. It will go over it again and again. It will invent lies against itself, pretending them those things might have happened, and will forgive nothing. Maybe it will begin to revenge itself too, but as it were, piecemeal, in trivial ways, from behind the stove, incognito, without believing either in its own right to revenge or in the success of its revenge, knowing beforehand that from all its efforts at revenge it will suffer 100 times more than he on whom it revenges itself, while he probably will not even feel it. On its deathbed, it will recall it all over again with interest accumulated over all the years, but it is just in that cold, abominable half-despair, half-belief, in that conscious burying oneself alive for grief in the underworld for 40 years, in that hyper-consciousness, and yet, to some extent, doubtful hopelessness of one's position, in that hell of unsatisfied desires turned inward, in that fever of oscillations, of resolutions taking forever and regretted again a minute later, that the savor of that strange enjoyment of which I have spoken lies. It is so subtle, sometimes so difficult to analyze consciously, that somewhat limited people, or simply people with strong nerves, will not understand anything at all in it. Possibly, you will add on your own account with a grin, people who have never received a slap in the face will not understand it either. And in that way you will politely hint to me that I, too, perhaps, have been slapped in the face in my life, and so I speak as an expert. I'll bet that you're thinking that. But set your minds at rest, gentlemen. I have not received a slap in the face, though it doesn't matter to me at all what you may think about it. Possibly, I even myself regret that I have given so few slaps in the face during my life. But enough. Not another word on the subject of such extreme interest to you. I will continue calmly about people with strong nerves who do not understand a certain refinement of enjoyment, though in certain circumstances these gentlemen bellow their loudest like bulls, though this, let us suppose, does them the greatest honor, yet, as I have already said, confronted with the impossible, they at once resign themselves. Does the impossible mean the stone wall? What stone wall? Why, of course, the laws of nature. The conclusions of natural science, of mathematics. As soon as they prove to you, for instance, that you are descended from a monkey, then it is no use scowling, accept it as a fact. When they prove to you that in reality 1 drop of your own fat must be dearer to you than 100,000 of your fellow creatures, and that this conclusion is the final solution of all so-called virtues and duties and all such ravings and prejudices, then you might as well accept it. You can't do anything about it, because 2 times 2 is a law of mathematics. Just try refuting it. But really, they will shout at you, there is no use protesting. It is a case of 2 times 2 makes 4. Nature does not ask your permission. Your wishes, and whether you like or dislike her laws, does not concern her. You are bound to accept her as she is, and consequently also all her conclusions. A wall, you see, is a wall, etc., etc. Good God! But what do I care about the laws of nature and arithmetic when for some reason I dislike those laws, and the fact that 2 times 2 makes 4? Of course, I cannot break through a wall by battering my head against it if I really do not have the strength to break through it, but I'm not going to resign myself to it simply because it is a stone wall and I'm not strong enough. As though such a stone wall really were a consolation and really did contain some word of consolation, if only because it is as true as 2 times 2 makes 4. Absurdity of all absurdities. How much better it is to understand it all, to be conscious of it all the impossibilities under the stone walls, not to resign yourself to a single one of those impossibilities and stone walls if it disgusts you to resign yourself, to reach, through the most inevitable logical combinations, the most revolting conclusions on the everlasting theme that you are yourself somehow to blame even for the stone wall. Though, again, it is as clear as day you are not to blame in the least, and therefore grinding your teeth in silent impotence sensuously to sink into inertia, brooding on the fact that it turns out that there is even no one for you to feel vindictive against, that you have not, and perhaps never will have, an object for your spite, that it is a sleight of hand, a bitter juggling, a card sharper's trick, that is simply a mess, no knowing what and no knowing who. But in spite of all these uncertainties and jugglings, still there is an ache in you, and the more you do not know, the worse the ache. Well, that was chapter 3. Click on chapter 4 to continue the story. This was Let's Read with Mr. Thomas. And remember, be well, gentle readers.